Hi, I'm Ed Amorosa from Tag Cyber, and I'm here with my longtime friend Bruce Flitcroft, who runs TenFour, and I want to welcome you to our studio.
Thanks, Ed.
It's great to see you. Hey, before we start, because we're going to get into a lot about security and network and so on, give us kind of the 101 on TenFour and what you guys do for your customers.
All right. What TenFour does is we build, own, and operate global networks for companies, private networks. So we provide all the bandwidth, equipment, software to build networks for all their premise locations all over the world in a private, secure fashion, so that they don't have to own capital, they don't have to build it, they don't have to operate, they don't have to administer it. We provide all of the host and network layer as a service. Not too dissimilar from how cloud provides compute and storage as a service to companies, except in their model it's a public domain where it's shared. In ours it's all private domain where each company has their own infrastructure that they don't have to own anymore.
You first told me about the model a few years ago. I'm guessing you feel a little bit of satisfaction, because in the early days, I think you had to really explain that. It seems like that's a model that's being adopted everywhere now. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, we're seeing elements of adoption all over the industry. We're seeing companies come out with new services that are specific to a particular technology in this model, like phone systems or east-west security services, where the client doesn't have to own it anymore. It's full service, full life cycle by a vendor. That is compartmentalized versions of these little micro utilities, we're calling them. The larger challenge, though, is you need to integrate them. If you have too many micro utilities, it's like having 1,000 cloud vendors in your software application architecture. It becomes unwieldy. So our mission is to integrate all the various parts of the infrastructure platform into a single network with, doesn't matter if it's wireless access points, switches, routers, phones, cabling, bandwidth, access, and all of it's included as a single service, all fully integrated.
That's awesome. That's music to my ears, because nobody really likes doing that stuff. It's nice handing that off to the experts. Now, we have a big security audience here, so you've been telling me about a methodology that drives the work that you guys do at TenFour in terms of security, these different domains and layers. I think it's awesome. Take me through some of the pieces of that methodology.
Sure. So we ran into this struggle about 6 years ago around the idea of multiple domains.
Yeah.
As we would build a private domain infrastructure for a company, there was a certain amount of risk and liability and responsibility.
You're using domain in a generic sense, not like a .edu or something.
Right.
You mean a generic?
Yeah, we aren't talking about domains as think in terms of internet domains or
it's more abstract.
Yeah, the abstract concept is wherever your data is that you want to keep visibility or have responsibility for it. At that moment, that's what your domain looks like. Yeah. We abandoned the idea of physical perimeters a long time ago. We started to think about it where the data was and where it was still involved in a transaction.
That was one big monster domain behind a firewall.
Right.
Now you guys are virtualizing and breaking that up.
Yeah, we've realized that there's hundreds of domains now that a company's data can be traversing at on any given day or moment even. So we're thinking about it in domain management across public and private domains. That's the first part of it. We realize
public is one type, private's another, and you could have many of each.
Of course, yeah, you already do most likely. Yeah. You most likely have, most companies have 30, 40, 50, 100 different public domains they're already attached to. They all think of themselves as a single domain, but realistically, private enterprises have multiple private domains of their own. Subsidiary businesses, different business units sometimes have their own compute, monitoring, logging, tracking domains for their data inside their own organization. So this complexity had no rules to it. It had no structure in how to think about how to build networks and how to manage your data, and particularly the security across it. So we started with a framework about 3 years ago where we started to rationalize how to think about security across all these various domains. And we started to define the domains into two categories, public and private. And it wasn't just as easy as people referred to as public cloud and private cloud, like hybrid. It was more or less around the role and responsibility for what you need to do to the data, and then the transparency and visibility you have to expose the data, and then of course the liability of what happens if the data's corrupted, damaged, stolen, etc. So we started to think of definitions of these domains across those three variables, and came up with our own, quite honestly, internal definition. We call it's the TenFour multi-domain security strategy. Nobody's using it but us at the moment. We think it is in the beginning of how a lot of other institutions and companies are going to start thinking about their security in the next 2 or 3 years.
I mean, it sounds consistent with zero trust, right? It sounds very much along the same lines, that instead of this big monster thing that you hide behind a perimeter, physical perimeter, that the needs of the business drive the way the network is set up. Is that right? As opposed to the reverse, which is the way we used to do it.
Yeah, we aren't going to be able to stipulate when and where the data is going to be located, who's going to be in charge of it and manage it. We have to accept the idea that as it transitions into other domains, there has to be a set of rules or expectations about how that data is going to be treated, who's going to get access to it, no matter what domain, in our rough definition of how we're using domain here, is going to have to think about data reliability, data security, and data access.
Yeah.
So zero trust, we think that the good stuff that's happening in the industry in zero trust is happening in the identity and authentication side of the business. We see that people and devices are going to become free of the various business, public and private domains we're talking
Identity
about.
and authentication being one of the layers that cuts through the domains?
Yeah, so think about identity and authentication is going to be in the domain, sorry to use the word domain in two different ways, but is going to be in the purview of the individual or the device, right? So we're going to start seeing a move toward, instead of trying to do authentication and identity management inside the network or in the application, we're only going to see authorization happen at those levels. We're going to start seeing a lot of new technologies, a lot of new providers in the identity space, which is music to our ears because it fits very well into this framework that we're operating in. The identity and authentication element has to have a clear handoff or stage gates to what we consider the second zone of the framework, and that is network and host.
Right.
Network and host is where we are actually operating.
That's your wheelhouse.
That's our wheelhouse. Everything we've been working on for 7 years is to build network and host security into the network.
Yeah.
No longer make it part of the physical day-to-day activities. We're using a lot of machine-to-machine and automation technologies to build the security elements of network and host security right into the network. The key is that stage gate to the identity and authentication.
Stage gate's probably an interface or API or something?
Yeah, it can absolutely, hopefully be an API in the future, right? Sometimes it's still a manual process, sometimes it's a set of policies, network connections. It's still a host of different variable ways to connect, and it's different in each of our customers. Although we're changing the network and host segment of the framework, we're adapting to the identity and authentication.
So for you guys, as you're providing network support for a client, if they made a decision to go from one authentication provider to another, for you guys it's just whatever the interface is, you make the change, no big deal. Yeah.
So
where years ago that'd be a big problem.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it was a custom project every time.
Right.
It was a security and network and application projects.
Yeah, I can remember that. It's nice to think that is plug and play now.
So it would probably be useful to cover the third part of the framework, and that is the application and data security portion. So our framework thinks about security in three portions of the framework: the user or the endpoint, the network and the host layer, and then the application data. It really sounds oversimplified, but if we start thinking about handoffs between three different systems, we can start to separate it out into all these different domains with various vendors and suppliers and multiple internal domains, where the rules to go from one stage of the framework to the next can be standardized, hopefully through APIs.
Yeah. How's your message resonating with clients when you sit down and take them through the methodology? How do they respond to that?
Honestly, not very well. They become overwhelmed, right? They try to take this framework and apply it to what they've already done, because it seems most people in security they're trying to find the fix. How do they make this incremental improvement right now?
A quick fix.
Yeah, and they've tried multiple silver bullets for the last couple of years and they're not working. And this discussion says, step back and rethink your security. Way back, the way we were building security for 20 years never envisioned the environments we're in today or that we're going to be in the next 5 or 10 years. So stepping back and rethinking your framework, thinking about how you separate the workloads, what tools you're using, how you think about the data itself as it traverses all these, as we describe them, public and private domains. There are not products specifically in the market to do this. Today, there's pieces of it. You can assemble parts of it yourself, and there has to be this sort of belief that that's where you as a participant in the market are going to end up. You're going to have your data live in all these private and public domains that you don't have control of all the time. You want visibility into where your data goes, but you really want to just believe it's safe no matter where it traverses. And that framework doesn't exist today in the market. So what we're trying to do is build a structured framework, and we're doing it from the inside out. We're thinking about it from host and network security out to application and data and to identity and authentication. And we're having to imagine what that framework will look like because we're operating many of those private domain networks for our clients. We're having to think about it on their behalf, what it's going to look like in 5 years. And the discussion with them to rethink their security today and start adopting some of these strategies and methodologies that we're using to build more secure private domain networks, it's overwhelming. And they're looking for something right now. And we're offering them a framework to slowly become more efficient and more secure over time. But we only control 1/3 of the equation at TenFour. So there's also
But you can influence the interfaces and the interactions, certainly.
Absolutely.
And grease the skids.
And our customers need to understand it well enough for them to help influence the vendors in those, for their application vendors and their device or endpoint vendors, for them to start influencing how they think about their security strategy. Again, we haven't expected wide-scale adoption of this, even in our own clients yet. Because of the embedded base and the momentum that they have with their existing systems and security strategies. But there's going to come a point where they're going to just say uncle and go, this is becoming less and less efficient. There's better ideas out there.
I love it. I mean, I think you have to have a methodology and a model. A lot of times when I'm talking to businesses, I'll say, tell me about your security. And they start rattling off products. I have this, I have this, I have this, I have this. And if you ask, what's the goal, what's the scheme, sometimes it's the first time they ever really considered it. It's like, well, what do you mean? I have this, this. And you go, no, what are you trying to accomplish? So stick with it. I think the methodology is right. And I know you know this, but a lot of big companies are moving in that direction. This seems to be the tailwind that we feel toward, there's multiple domains. And as we said earlier, a lot of people would wrap the term zero trust in some very similar concepts. So it's awesome.
What we're hoping is that this framework of 3 types of security will simplify the discussion.
Yeah.
To your point, they need an objective and a strategy for both the endpoint user security, their network security, and their data security.
Yeah.
And if they can't think about it in those 3 terms, they'll never solve those, because there's very different technologies in all 3 areas. So they're going to need to think about their objectives in those 3 and then figure out a way, or we're helping figure out a way, I should say, to connect them, to make it a seamless security strategy across the transaction. It's just a framework. Like I said, we call it the TenFour, multi-domain security framework, but we're hoping that the industry names it something else and it becomes the standard for how people start thinking about their security strategies.
So let me put you on the spot. Let's talk future. I know you have a lot of opinions about where things are headed, both in networking and IT. When you get asked that, and I know you get asked every day that question, but what are some themes that people should be looking forward to? Well, primarily in networking, but in security and in the broader industry. What comes to mind?
The first one is the concept of hybrid cloud needs an overhaul. It is where the market is going, but not in the way people imagined it 8 years ago when they started using the term, and fairly liberally. The idea of hybrid clouds are, again, instead of calling them clouds, we're referring to them as domains.
Yeah.
Right? It's who's got responsibility for the data when it resides there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As we think about hybrid clouds, we think about hybrid domains, multi-domains.
Yeah, I like multi-domain. That makes sense to me.
And then the definition, what kind of domain is it? Who's responsible for what? What are the control levels? What's the responsibility? What's the liability?
So kind of from hybrid cloud to multi-domain as kind of a different way or better way of thinking about networks.
And thinking of the domains as different flavors of domain.
That's a good idea.
Right. Now the rules in security and IT are going to start evolving to standardize one type of domain communicates to another type of domain. Here's the rule.
Yeah.
Certain data types will have certain rules as it crosses domain boundaries. And these domain boundaries are going to be moving all the time. But as we look at how it traverses from one domain to the other, that's where the rules are going to apply as to how that data gets treated. Today, no one's spending enough time on that. And I think there's I've been talking for years, you talk about futures. I must have been 15 years ago, I said, when I looked at the Googles of the world, those companies got huge multiple valuations because they had a limitless asset. People gave them their data. Data was the ultimate asset. But we're still running 30 years behind in the government's view of the IT industry. The fact that accounting regulations still don't let you count data as an asset on your books is crazy to me. It's the largest asset. The highest valued companies in the world are because they have limitless amounts of asset that they never have to stand up on their balance sheet.
You count goodwill, you can't count
exactly.
Data, right?
It's crazy. I think data is far more valuable than goodwill.
I would agree.
So what we're going to see is as the regulations change in governments around the world, I think Europe and California are a little bit ahead than a lot of other areas, but we're going to start not just seeing privacy as the issue. We're going to start realizing that tracking the asset, which is the data itself, becomes the issue. And as the regulatory rules start to do that, we're going to see a forcing function on the enterprise, on business, on institutions, having to figure out and track that data because there's now real liability if it becomes a real asset. That's when this idea of being able to track it across domains is going to become the imperative. And I think we're still 5, 6, 7 years out from that. But I think that's going to be one of the future predictions, that we're going to have to be able to track our data no matter what domain it's in, and not in the public domains today where they just want your data and don't want to tell you what they're doing with it or where it is because that's an asset that they're getting. But once it becomes an asset on their books, companies are going to be individuals will be much less likely to just give it away for free unless they know what's going to happen to it, where it's going, what it's going to get used for. We're seeing it being driven by the privacy discussion. I think people are going to be driven by greed and value as well. As soon as it becomes an asset, we're going to see the behaviors change. I think it's inevitable. So the way we think about data traversing networks is going to change because, as we know, economics does drive everything eventually. So as that change happens, I think we're going to see a realization in the industry.
Do you see businesses in the future relying more on experts to do the security? Because at the root of your business, one thing I've always observed and admired is that you guys are experts, and people can take advantage of that expertise, and it just raises the level of capability. You can do it yourself,
Yep.
or you let an expert. Do you think security will start seeing a little bit more of that? Because there's a lot of do-it-yourself security in enterprise today.
Mostly do it yourself.
It is mostly do-it-yourself.
I believe that part of it is going to fall completely out of the domain, or out of the responsibility. I almost used the word again.
That's okay. It works in so many different contexts.
It's going to fall out of the responsibility of the individual company, right? We're going to see that risk, some of the risk, pushed to the vendors. We see it today in models like ours, in new offers being brought to the market about other private domain offers. A couple of the largest companies in the industry have just launched private domain infrastructure offers in the last few months.
Right.
What that's going to do is it's going to put them in the liability circle. They're going to have to take responsibility. When they do, they're going to have to take responsibility for some of the security functions. Think about
vulnerability management, patch, all the
patch, vulnerability, continuous
scanning,
monitoring, scanning. Those things, if they own that hard asset, like the piece of equipment or the software package or circuit, and they don't actually sell it to you, it becomes a service. Part of the responsibility for the security embedded in those assets, we call them ITUs at TenFour, they're going to have to take on. So we're going to see a shift of part of the security responsibility move to the vendors as they provide outcome-based services and consumption economic-based business models like as a service. That's going to start moving some of the role and responsibility of security to the vendor, but not all of it. What's left in the enterprise, I think, is going to split into two areas. One is individual responsibility for things which are differentiators, those things that make their secret sauce, tied to their product, tied to their service, tied to their end user customer information. We're going to start to see them take on expertise only in that area. I think most of it's going to happen in the application side of the security model. I think that's never going to end up leaving the enterprise or the customer. Agree. The last one is sort of interesting. That's the stuff that you can outsource, right? You still have responsibility for it, but you outsource it. It's like thinking of how you do your accounting with your accounting firms, your law with outside law firms. And I think in the identity management space, I think in some of the encryption spaces, we're going to see the security vendors specialize. We're going to start seeing them where they're going to take more and more responsibility for a smaller and smaller subset of the actions and activities and provide them as specialized services. Again, they'll most likely be subscription based. So I see, I see three different trends happening in the marketplace. One is some things just shouldn't be the responsibility of the customer. That should be built into the technology itself, whether it's the network or the device or the asset. Application security is going to stay within the enterprise. You want to keep the valuable data, the control of the algorithms, the control of the company-specific data in your control. You're not going to outsource it.
It's the most intimate with the specifics of a business as opposed to general infrastructure.
And it's what makes your competitor be able to beat you.
Yeah, right.
Your competitor cannot beat you because of how you configure a wireless access point or how your users log in.
Yeah.
They can beat you if they get access to your customer data, your algorithms, et cetera. I think that's really core to who we are as people. We're competitive.
They can lose to you if they do it wrong. Right?
They could. They could stumble and fall.
If you're down, you're down.
But the best way to take competitive advantage is to steal the actual information that's the differentiator.
Yeah.
Nobody gets differentiation in their network or in their devices, their laptops or cell phones. They get it in their software, their algorithms, and their data itself. So I think that's going to move more and more. The IT security department is going to get focused more and more on that over the next few years.
We are in the latter portion of 2019. We'll have to freeze the video, come back in 2 years, and I suspect everything you said will be right. You've had a pretty good track record.
Well, most of the stuff I say people think's just batshit crazy until a few years later.
You still enjoy running the company? You guys are growing like a weed. You're really, really getting bigger.
Yeah, we've grown. We're starting to get attention from a lot of companies we never got attention from before, which is good. And I think it has to do with the adoption rate of the model. We've had analysts say they thought that the outcome-based services in infrastructure were going to be adopted by enterprise a few years ago. It wasn't. It's still moving quite slowly. It's only the really progressive CIOs and thought leaders that are dabbling and putting their foot in the water in this sort of business model today. But we liken it back to, it took IT 8 years to buy SaaS. It took a decade to accept cloud. We don't expect this distributed infrastructure utility as being, even though it's the logical next step in the evolution of IT. We understand there's going to be resistance from IT to change how they operate, but it's inevitable. We have to.
Well, keep doing what you're doing. We all benefit. We are great admirers of your business and your approach. And
thank you.
we appreciate you stopping by and sharing with us.
Always a pleasure, Ed.
It was great to see you. And we will see you next time.